I've been a sleep technician at Riverside Sleep Center for 8 years, and what I discovered on the night of March 15, 2023, still makes me check my locks twice before bed. What started as a routine overnight sleep study turned into something that made me question everything I thought I knew about the patients we trust to help. My name is Lisa, and I need to tell someone about this before it eats me alive completely. The sleep lab is located in a converted medical building on Cedar Lane, just outside Millfield. It's a quiet place, has to be, given what we do. We monitor patients overnight, tracking their sleep patterns, breathing, and brain activity to diagnose disorders like sleep apnea and insomnia. Most nights, it's peaceful work. Patients come in around 9 p.m., get hooked up to monitoring equipment, and sleep until morning while I watch their data from the control room. That night, I had 3 patients scheduled. The first 2 were routine: an older man with suspected sleep apnea and a middle-aged woman with chronic insomnia. The third patient was new, Marcus Henderson, a 34-year-old software engineer who'd been referred by his primary care physician for what his chart described as severe night terrors and unusual sleep behavior. Marcus arrived right on time at 9:15 p.m. He seemed normal enough, polite, soft-spoken, maybe a little nervous like most first-time patients. He filled out the standard paperwork and mentioned he'd been having sleep problems for about 6 months. His girlfriend had apparently been disturbed by his behavior during sleep and insisted he get help. "What kind of behavior?" I asked as I prepared his room. "Talking mostly. Sometimes I seem to be having conversations with someone." "She says it's getting worse?" He paused, looking uncomfortable. "Sometimes I get up and walk around, but I don't remember any of it." Nothing unusual there. Sleepwalking and sleep talking are common enough. I got him settled in room 3, attached the standard monitoring equipment, electrodes on his scalp and face to measure brain waves and eye movement, chest and abdomen bands to monitor breathing, a pulse oximeter on his finger. Everything looked normal as he drifted off around 10:30 p.m. The first few hours were routine. His sleep patterns looked typical for someone with mild sleep disturbance. I monitored his brain waves, breathing, and movement while catching up on paperwork and checking on my other 2 patients, who were sleeping peacefully. Around 1:30 a.m., Marcus entered REM sleep, and that's when things started getting strange. His brain wave patterns became unusually active, more active than I'd ever seen in 8 years of doing this job. But what caught my attention wasn't the medical data. It was what I could hear through the intercom system. Marcus had started talking in his sleep, but it wasn't the usual mumbling or unclear speech I was used to hearing. He was having what sounded like a detailed, coherent conversation with someone. His voice was clear, purposeful, and he was pausing as if listening to responses. "Yes, I understand," he said clearly. "The information is in the blue folder on her desk." I leaned closer to the intercom. Patients sometimes talk in their sleep, but this sounded like he was on a phone call. "No, she leaves the office around 6 p.m. every Tuesday. The security guard does his rounds at 7:15 and 9:45. My stomach started to tighten. This didn't sound like normal sleep talking. I checked his brain wave patterns again. He was definitely in deep REM sleep, but the conversation continued. "The safe combination is 4-7-2-9. She keeps the backup files in there." I immediately started recording the audio, which is part of our standard protocol for unusual sleep behavior. But as I listened, I realized I was hearing something that sounded less like a sleep disorder and more like planning. "The alarm system gets turned off at 6:45 a.m. when the cleaning crew arrives. That's your window." I felt ice in my veins. I grabbed my phone and started recording as backup while the official equipment captured everything. This wasn't sleep talking. This was too detailed, too specific, too organized. For the next 20 minutes, Marcus continued what appeared to be a conversation about breaking into someone's office, stealing files, and avoiding security. He mentioned specific names, addresses, and detailed information about building layouts and security procedures. The most chilling part was how normal he looked. His eyes were closed, his body relaxed, all the monitoring equipment showing typical REM sleep patterns. But his voice was alert and engaged, as if he was wide awake and planning a crime. Around 2:15 a.m., the conversation seemed to end. Marcus rolled over and fell into quieter sleep. I sat there staring at the monitors, trying to process what I just heard. I knew I had to do something, but what? Call the police and tell them a sleeping patient had confessed to planning a burglary? Report a patient for something he said while unconscious? I'd never encountered anything like this in my training. I decided to document everything carefully and continue monitoring. Maybe there was a medical explanation I wasn't considering. The rest of the night passed without incident. Marcus woke up at 6:30 a.m., seeming refreshed and normal. During his exit interview, I carefully asked if he remembered any dreams. "Nothing specific," he said. "I think I slept pretty well, actually. Better than I have in months." I asked about the conversations his girlfriend had mentioned. "Yeah, she says I talk sometimes, but I never remember it. Did I say anything last night?" I hesitated. "You did talk some during REM sleep. We recorded it as part of your study. Dr. Richardson will review everything and discuss the results with you." Marcus nodded and left, seeming satisfied. But as I watched him walk to his car, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. He pulled out his phone and made a call. Even though I couldn't hear what he was saying, his body language looked exactly the same as when he'd been asleep, the same posture, the same purposeful gestures. I spent the rest of my shift debating what to do. By the time Dr. Richardson arrived that morning, I'd made my decision. I played him the recording and explained what I'd observed. Dr. Richardson listened to the entire thing twice, his expression growing more troubled each time. "Lisa, in 20 years of sleep medicine, I've never heard anything like this. This isn't typical sleep talking or even complex sleep behavior. This is something else entirely." We agreed that we needed to contact the police, but we also needed to be careful about patient confidentiality laws. Dr. Richardson made the call to the local police department, explaining that we had potentially recorded evidence of planned criminal activity during a medical procedure. Detective Sarah Williams arrived within an hour. After reviewing the recording and our documentation, she was as disturbed as we were. "The level of detail is extraordinary," she said. "He's giving specific addresses, security codes, time schedules. This isn't random sleep talking. Someone is either feeding him this information, or he's somehow accessing it unconsciously." Detective Williams took copies of all our recordings and documentation. She also asked us to contact her immediately if Marcus scheduled any follow-up appointments. "We're going to investigate the addresses and business names he mentioned," she told us. "If any of these places get broken into in the next few weeks, we'll have probable cause for a warrant." I thought that would be the end of it, but 3 days later, Detective Williams called me at home. "Lisa, we need to talk. 2 of the businesses Marcus mentioned in his sleep were burglarized last night. The thieves knew exactly where to find what they were looking for and how to avoid security. They got away with financial records and client information worth hundreds of thousands of dollars." The investigation that followed revealed something that still gives me chills. Marcus Henderson wasn't just a software engineer with sleep problems. He was part of a sophisticated identity theft ring that had been operating in the area for over a year. But here's the part that haunts me. Marcus genuinely seemed to have no conscious knowledge of his criminal activities. During questioning, he passed multiple polygraph tests when he claimed he didn't remember the conversations or know about the burglaries. The police discovered that Marcus had been subjected to some form of conditioning or programming, possibly through drugs or psychological manipulation, that allowed his criminal associates to communicate with him and receive information while he was asleep. He was essentially being used as an unconscious informant and planning tool. The case broke open a much larger criminal network, and Marcus ultimately became a key witness rather than a defendant. But the psychological damage was severe. He's still in therapy, trying to understand how his own mind was used against him without his knowledge. As for me, I've never looked at sleep the same way. Every patient who talks in their sleep now makes me wonder what secrets might be buried in their unconscious minds. Every peaceful night in the sleep lab carries the possibility that I might overhear something that changes everything. The sleep center upgraded our security protocols and staff training after the incident, but nothing can change the fundamental truth I learned that night. Sleep, which we think of as the most private and vulnerable state, can be weaponized in ways we never imagined. What scares me most is knowing that Marcus was probably not the only victim. Somewhere out there, other people might be living double lives they don't even know about, their sleeping minds hijacked for criminal purposes while they remain completely unaware. I still work at the sleep center, but now I listen to every conversation, document every unusual behavior, and wonder how many of our patients are carrying secrets they don't even know they have. That case taught me that the line between victim and perpetrator can be thinner than we think, and sometimes the most dangerous criminals are the ones who don't even know they're committing crimes. So tell me, have you ever been told you talk in your sleep? What if the conversations you can't remember are the ones that matter most? What secrets might your unconscious mind be keeping from you? I'm Officer Jennifer Martinez with Fairview Animal Control, and what I discovered in November of 2023 still makes me question whether animals know things we don't. After 15 years responding to animal behavior complaints, I thought I'd seen everything. But the case on Elm Drive taught me that sometimes when pets act strange, there's a very real and terrifying reason that goes deeper than anyone could imagine. The call came in on a cold Tuesday morning, November 7th. Mrs. Patricia Collins, an elderly woman living alone on Elm Drive, was reporting that her neighbor's German Shepherd had been acting disturbed for several weeks. According to her complaint, the dog spent hours every day and night staring at her basement window, whining and pacing along the fenced line between their properties. That dog hasn't been right since early October, Mrs. Collins told me when I arrived at her small ranch-style home in Fairview. The house was well maintained but showed signs of an elderly person living alone, overgrown hedges, newspapers piling up on the porch, curtains drawn tight. He just stands there looking at my basement, day and night. Sometimes he howls. It's keeping me awake, and frankly, it's making me nervous. I looked across the yard to the neighboring property where a large German Shepherd named Rex was indeed standing at the chain-link fence, staring intently at Mrs. Collins' basement window. The dog was magnificent, probably 85 pounds, with the alert posture and intelligent eyes typical of well-bred German Shepherds. But even from a distance, I could see his body language was wrong. His ears were pinned forward, his tail held low, and there was a tension in his stance that spoke of sustained stress. "How long has this been going on exactly?" I asked Mrs. Collins. "Started around October 15th, maybe the 16th. I remember because it was the day after my grandson visited for my birthday. Rex was normal that weekend, but then suddenly he changed. At first I thought maybe he was sick, but his owner says he's fine." The dog's owner, Robert Thompson, came outside when he saw my animal control vehicle. He was a man in his mid-40s, well-dressed in khakis and a polo shirt, with the kind of careful grooming that suggested he worked in an office environment. His demeanor was polite but slightly agitated, and I noticed he kept glancing nervously at Rex. "I don't know what's wrong with Rex," he told me, extending his hand for a firm handshake. "He's normally a calm dog, very well trained. I got him from a breeder in Oregon 3 years ago, and he's never shown any behavioral problems. But for the past month, he's been obsessed with that basement window. I've tried bringing him inside, but he whines and scratches at the door until I let him back out." I spent the next 20 minutes observing Rex's behavior. The dog never took his eyes off that basement window for more than a few seconds. He would pace 3 or 4 steps along the fence line, sit for a moment with his head cocked as if listening, then stand again and resume his vigil. His ears remained forward, his tail stayed low, and every few minutes he would let out a low whine that sounded almost mournful. "This is unusual behavior for a German Shepherd," I told Thompson. "They're typically very task-oriented dogs. When they fixate like this, it's usually because they're detecting something specific. Has anything changed in your routine or environment recently? New food, new schedule, any construction or changes to the neighborhood? Thompson shook his head, but I noticed a slight hesitation. Nothing significant. I work from home most days now, software consulting, so my schedule is pretty consistent. Although, he paused, looking uncomfortable. Mrs. Collins did mention she's been having some issues with her basement recently. Something about strange smells and sounds. Maybe Rex is picking up on something I can't detect. What kind of smells and sounds? I asked. I don't know the details. You'd have to ask her. I decided to speak with Mrs. Collins again about these basement issues. When I knocked on her door, she seemed relieved to have someone official to talk to about what was clearly a source of significant stress. Oh yes, there have been problems, she said, inviting me into her tidy living room. The house had the feel of someone who lived there for decades. Family photos covering every surface, well-worn furniture, the lingering scent of lavender, and old books. It started around the same time Rex began acting strange. I keep smelling something awful coming from down there, and sometimes I hear noises. What kind of noises, Mrs. Collins? Scratching mostly. Sometimes thumping, like something heavy being moved around. I thought maybe mice or rats, but it's too loud for that. And the smell. She wrinkled her nose. It's getting worse every day. Sweet and rotten at the same time. Sometimes it comes up through the vents, and I have to open all the windows. My animal control training includes basic knowledge of pest control and property issues, and what she was describing raised immediate red flags. The combination of strange smells and sounds, along with an animal's persistent behavioral change, often indicates something more serious than a simple nuisance complaint. Mrs. Collins, when did you last go down to your basement? I haven't been down there in weeks. The stairs are difficult for me since my hip replacement, and with the smell and noises I've been avoiding it. My grandson usually helps me with anything down there, but he lives in Sacramento and can't come very often. Have you noticed any other changes around your property? Anyone coming or going at unusual times? She thought for a moment. Well, there have been some nights when I thought I heard someone outside. Footsteps on the gravel by the side of the house. But I figured it was just cats or raccoons. We get a lot of wildlife through here. I explained that I'd like to investigate the basement to determine if there was an environmental factor causing Rex's behavior. She agreed immediately, seeming grateful that someone was taking her concerns seriously. I have to admit, Officer Martinez, Rex's behavior has been frightening me. Dogs sense things we don't they? My late husband always said animals know when something isn't right. The basement was accessed through a door in her kitchen. As soon as she opened it, I was hit with the smell she described, sickeningly sweet with an underlying rot that made my stomach turn and my eyes water. It was the kind of smell that immediately triggers every alarm bell in your head, the kind that makes you want to run. Mrs. Collins, I need you to wait upstairs while I investigate this. The smell is quite strong, and I want to make sure it's safe. I grabbed a flashlight from my kit and started down the wooden stairs, which creaked ominously under my weight. The basement was typical for a house built in the 1960s, concrete walls, low ceiling, used for storage and utilities. Cardboard boxes lined the walls, and an old washer and dryer sat in one corner next to a water heater. But as I swept my flashlight around the space, I immediately noticed several things that were very wrong. First, one of the concrete walls had a large, dark stain spreading from floor to ceiling. The stain was roughly human-shaped and appeared to be relatively fresh. There were still damp spots where liquid had seeped through the concrete. Second, there were muddy footprints on the basement floor that were far too large to belong to Mrs. Collins. The prints led from the exterior storm door, which I now noticed was slightly ajar, to the area around the water heater. Third, and most disturbing, there were fresh scratch marks in the concrete floor near the water heater, as if someone had been digging with hand tools. A small pile of concrete dust and debris sat next to what appeared to be a partially filled hole about 2 feet deep. But it was what I found scattered around the makeshift excavation that made me immediately reach for my radio to call for backup. There were several pieces of women's jewelry, rings, necklaces, earrings, that clearly didn't belong to an elderly woman. Mixed in with the jewelry were driver's licenses and credit cards bearing the names and photos of 3 different young women. The cards and IDs were dirty and appeared to have been hastily buried and then dug up again. I also found what appeared to be pieces of torn clothing, some stained with what looked like blood, and a cell phone that had been smashed but was still partially intact. I backed up the stairs immediately, my heart pounding, and called Detective Sarah Williams, who I knew from previous animal control cases that had uncovered criminal activity. "Jennifer, what exactly are you looking at?" she asked when I described the scene. "Detective Williams, I think we might have discovered why that dog has been so focused on this basement. There's evidence of recent digging, personal items that don't belong to the homeowner, and that smell. I think we need CSI down here immediately. And I think we need to take a very close look at the neighbor who owns that German Shepherd. Stay put and don't let anyone else into that basement. I'm sending units now." While I waited for backup, I went back outside to observe Rex again. The dog was still at his post by the fence, but now that I knew what was in that basement, his behavior took on a completely different meaning. He wasn't just staring at the window, he was standing guard, maintaining a vigil over what he somehow knew was a crime scene. When I looked more closely at the basement window from the outside, I could see that the glass was slightly cracked, and there were scratch marks on the window frame that looked like they'd been made by fingernails. Within an hour, Mrs. Collins' basement was swarming with police officers, crime scene investigators, and Detective Williams. What they uncovered over the next several hours was worse than I had imagined. The stain on the concrete wall was blood, a lot of it. Forensic analysis would later show it belonged to at least 3 different people. The digging in the floor had been an attempt to bury evidence, but the job was incomplete. Hidden behind the water heater were driver's licenses, credit cards, and jewelry belonging to 3 different women who had been reported missing over the past 6 months in neighboring counties. But the most disturbing discovery was in the partially filled hole. Crime scene investigators found clothing fibers, more blood evidence, hair samples, and what appeared to be attempts to dispose of biological material using lye and other chemicals. Detective Williams pulled me aside as the investigation continued into the evening. "Jennifer, we need to talk about the neighbor. How well do you know Robert Thompson?" "I just met him today. He seemed cooperative, concerned about his dog's behavior." "Why?" "We ran his information. He has a history of harassment complaints from women in 2 other states, Colorado and Nevada. Moved here about 8 months ago. And his dog's behavior started right around the time the first woman went missing from this area." The pieces were falling into place in a way that made my skin crawl. Rex hadn't been acting strange because of basement pest problems. He'd been detecting evidence of something far worse. "There's more," Detective Williams continued. "We checked with the utility company. There have been several reports of tampering with the electrical meter on Mrs. Collins' house. Someone's been bypassing the system to use power without it showing up on her bill." "For what?" "Probably power tools. The kind you need to break up concrete and dig holes." Over the next few days, the investigation revealed that Robert Thompson had been using Mrs. Collins' basement as his personal disposal site for evidence from his crimes. Mrs. Collins, who was partially deaf and had mobility issues, hadn't been aware that someone was accessing her basement through the exterior storm door, which had a broken lock that Thompson had been exploiting for months. Thompson had been entering the basement at night, using it as a temporary storage and disposal site for evidence from his attacks on women he'd met through online dating apps. He would take his victims to a remote location, kill them, then transport evidence to Mrs. Collins' basement for disposal. The basement's location, hidden from street view and belonging to an elderly woman who rarely went downstairs, made it a perfect hiding spot. Rex had been detecting the decomposition smells and blood evidence that human noses couldn't pick up. His persistent focus on that basement window had been his way of alerting everyone that something was seriously wrong. When police arrested Thompson the next morning, They found detailed plans on his computer showing how he'd been monitoring Mrs. Collins' routine for months. He had photos of her house, notes about when she received deliveries, when she went to bed, when she left for grocery shopping. He'd been planning to completely dispose of all the evidence and move to another state. But Rex's behavior had drawn too much attention before he could finish. The computer also revealed that Thompson had been operating this way in other states. He would move to a new area, find an elderly person living alone with accessible basement or garage space, and use their property as a staging area for his crimes. When he was finished, he would disappear, leaving behind no evidence that could be traced to him. In Colorado, an elderly man had reported strange smells from his garage for weeks before Thompson suddenly moved away. In Nevada, a woman had found evidence of digging in her basement after her neighbor unexpectedly relocated. In both cases, the evidence had been dismissed as minor vandalism or animal intrusion. 3 missing women were found murdered, and evidence suggested Thompson had been operating this way for at least 5 years. If Rex hadn't persistently alerted everyone to the basement, Thompson might have succeeded in covering up his crimes and disappearing again, leaving behind no trace of his victims. Mrs. Collins was traumatized to learn her basement had been used for such horrific purposes, but she was also grateful. "That dog saved lives," she told me through tears. "If he hadn't kept staring and whining, no one would have investigated. Those poor women would never have been found." Rex was temporarily placed with a foster family during the investigation, but the psychological impact on the dog was significant. The veterinary behaviorist who evaluated him said the prolonged exposure to death and violence had created lasting trauma. The dog showed signs of severe anxiety, wouldn't eat regularly, and had developed a fear of basements and confined spaces. However, the same behaviorist noted that Rex's actions showed remarkable intelligence and loyalty. German Shepherds are bred to be protective and alert to danger, and Rex had been trying to protect his community in the only way he knew how. The case changed how I approach animal behavior complaints. Now when I get calls about pets acting strangely or fixating on specific locations, I dig deeper. Animals often detect things we can't, chemicals, sense, even human behavioral patterns that signal danger. What haunts me most is knowing that Thompson had been planning this for months, carefully choosing an elderly victim who wouldn't notice his activities. He'd been counting on people dismissing a dog's behavior as just a nuisance, and he'd nearly succeeded. Rex's story became somewhat famous in our department. We use it in training now to show how animal behavior can be the first indicator of human criminal activity. Dogs, especially, have been known to detect everything from drug operations to human trafficking to violent crimes. Their senses are so much more acute than ours that they often know about dangerous situations long before we do. I still drive by that house on Elm Drive sometimes. Mrs. Collins moved to assisted living after the investigation, unable to feel safe in her home. The house sits empty now, but I always think about Rex standing at that fence, trying to tell us something was terribly wrong. The case taught me that sometimes the most important witnesses have 4 legs and can't speak. But if we know how to listen, they'll tell us everything we need to know. 6 months later, Rex was adopted by a retired police officer who specialized in working with traumatized service animals. Last I heard, he was doing much better, though he still shows signs of what his experiences did to him. But he's also being trained as a cadaver detection dog, putting his tragic experience to good use helping solve other cases. Thompson was sentenced to life in prison without parole. During his sentencing, the judge specifically mentioned that if not for the vigilance of a concerned animal, he might have continued killing indefinitely. Has your pet ever acted strangely around certain people or places? What if their behavior was trying to warn you about something dangerous? How well do you really know what's happening in your neighborhood, and what signs might you be missing? I'm Maria Santos, and I've been working as a night shift caregiver at Sunset Manor Nursing Home in Brookside for 12 years. What I discovered happening to our residents during their most vulnerable hours in January 2024 still makes me check on my own elderly mother 3 times a night. Sometimes the people we trust most with our loved ones are the ones we should fear. After what happened with Mrs. Collins and that dog situation, and the sleep lab incident I heard about through my cousin who works at the medical center. I thought I'd seen every way people could exploit the vulnerable. But what I found at Sunset Manor proved that predators find victims wherever they can, and the elderly are some of the most defenseless targets of all. Sunset Manor is a 120-bed facility on Willow Court, specializing in memory care and long-term nursing. I work the overnight shift, 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., responsible for 48 residents on the second floor. Most of our residents have dementia, Alzheimer's, or other cognitive impairments that make them entirely dependent on staff for their care and safety. The night shift is usually quiet. Residents are given their evening medications around 9 p.m., and most are sleeping soundly by the time I arrive. My duties include hourly bed checks, turning residents to prevent bed sores, changing anyone who needs it, and monitoring for any medical emergencies. It's peaceful work, mostly, and I take pride in keeping our residents comfortable and dignified. But starting in early January, I began noticing something that didn't seem right. Dr. Kevin Mitchell, one of our newer staff physicians, had been staying late several nights a week, claiming he was updating medical records and reviewing patient files. This wasn't unusual. Doctors often work long hours, and comprehensive documentation is required for nursing home care. But what caught my attention was that he was spending time in patient rooms during the night shift, not just in the office. The first time I noticed, it was around 1:30 a.m. on January 12th. I was doing my rounds when I saw light coming from under the door of room 217, where Mrs. Rose Peterson, an 89-year-old woman with advanced Alzheimer's, was supposed to be sleeping. I knocked softly and entered to find Dr. Mitchell standing beside her bed with a tablet computer, apparently taking notes. Mrs. Peterson was sound asleep, breathing peacefully. "Oh, Maria," he said, looking slightly startled. "I was just checking on Mrs. Peterson. She's been having some sleep disturbances according to the day's shift notes, so I wanted to observe her sleep patterns firsthand." This seemed reasonable enough. Sleep disorders are common in elderly patients, and direct observation is sometimes necessary for proper diagnosis and treatment. Dr. Mitchell was young, maybe early 30s, and had come highly recommended when he joined our staff 6 months earlier. "Is there anything I should be documenting?" I asked. No, she's sleeping well now. I'm just making some notes about her positioning and breathing patterns. You can continue your rounds." I left, but something felt off. In 12 years of night shift work, I'd never had a doctor spend that much time observing a sleeping patient unless there was a serious medical concern. Mrs. Peterson's charts showed no recent sleep issues. 3 nights later, I encountered Dr. Mitchell again, this time in room 203 with Mr. Harold Webb, a 92-year-old man with moderate dementia. Again, he was standing beside the bed with his tablet, apparently taking notes while the patient slept. "More sleep studies?" I asked. "Yes, we're seeing some concerning patterns in several of our residents. I'm trying to establish baseline sleep behaviors so we can identify any changes that might indicate declining health." Over the next 2 weeks, I encountered Dr. Mitchell in patient rooms during the night shift at least 8 more times. Always the same setup: elderly residents sleeping peacefully, doctor standing beside the bed with tablet, taking what appeared to be detailed notes. But on January 28th, I saw something that made my blood run cold. I was approaching room 211 when I heard a soft clicking sound, like a camera shutter. I paused outside the door and listened. The sound repeated several times, followed by the quiet tapping of someone typing on a tablet. I knocked and entered to find Dr. Mitchell beside the bed of Mrs. Dorothy Kim, a 91-year-old woman with severe dementia. She was sleeping deeply, but what I noticed immediately was that her blanket had been pulled down to her waist, exposing her upper body beneath her thin nightgown. "Dr. Mitchell?" I said quietly. He looked up, and for just a moment, I saw something in his expression that wasn't medical professionalism. It was quickly replaced by his usual friendly demeanor. "Maria, good timing. I was just documenting some skin condition concerns for Mrs. Kim." The day's shift mentioned possible bed sores, so I wanted to examine her positioning. He pulled the blanket back up to Mrs. Kim's chin, but I had seen enough to know that what I'd witnessed wasn't a medical examination. Mrs. Kim had no bed sores, no skin conditions, and no medical reason for her blanket to be pulled down. I'll make sure to note that in my report, I said, trying to keep my voice neutral. That won't be necessary. I'll handle the medical documentation. That night, I couldn't sleep when I got home. Something was very wrong, but I wasn't sure what I was dealing with or who I could trust. Dr. Mitchell was well liked by the administration, had excellent credentials, and had never given anyone reason to doubt his professionalism. If I made accusations without solid evidence, it could destroy my career. But I also knew that if I was right about what I suspected, vulnerable elderly people were being victimized by someone they trusted completely. I decided to start documenting everything I observed. I began carrying a small notebook and recording every time I encountered Dr. Mitchell during night rounds, the time, the patient, what he claimed to be doing, and any details that seemed unusual. Over the next week, the pattern became clear. Dr. Mitchell was visiting the rooms of female residents almost exclusively, always during the deepest part of the night when they would be in their most vulnerable sleep states. He was spending 15 to 20 minutes in each room, much longer than any legitimate medical observation would require. On February 6th, I made a discovery that confirmed my worst fears. I was in the supply closet around 2 a.m. when I heard Dr. Mitchell's voice coming from the nearby break room. He was on his cell phone, speaking quietly, but the walls in Sunset Manor are thin and I could hear most of the conversation. The documentation is going well, he was saying. I've got detailed files on about 30 subjects now. Sleep positions, breathing patterns, physical responses to stimuli. The dementia patients are perfect because they can't report anything even if they do wake up. There was a pause while he listened to whoever was on the other end. No, the night shift staff doesn't suspect anything. I've been careful to maintain the medical professional cover. They think I'm just being thorough with patient care. Another pause. I can probably get another month of data before I need to move on. The material is exactly what the client specifications requested: elderly subjects, compromised mental state, completely unaware of being documented. My hands were shaking as I listened. Dr. Mitchell wasn't conducting legitimate medical research. He was documenting vulnerable elderly patients for some kind of exploitation, and he was being paid to do it. I carefully recorded everything I could remember from the phone conversation, including the date and time. Then I made a decision that would change everything. I called Detective Williams, whose card I still had from when she consulted with our facility about elder abuse cases the previous year. It was 3 a.m., but I left a detailed voicemail explaining what I'd observed and overheard. Detective Williams called me back at 6 a.m., just as my shift was ending. Maria, what you're describing sounds like it could be part of a larger criminal enterprise. We've been investigating reports of elderly exploitation that might be connected to what you've witnessed. Can you meet me this morning to go over everything in detail? At 9 a.m., I sat in Detective Williams' office and told her everything I'd observed over the past month. She listened carefully, taking notes, asking detailed questions about Dr. Mitchell's behavior and the specific residents he'd been documenting. Maria, we've been investigating a network that creates and distributes exploitative material featuring vulnerable adults, elderly people with dementia, disabled individuals, anyone who can't consent or report abuse. If Dr. Mitchell is part of this network, what you've documented could be the evidence we need to shut down a major operation. Detective Williams explained that they would need to conduct a careful investigation to gather evidence without alerting Dr. Mitchell that he was under suspicion. They would install surveillance equipment in the nursing home and monitor his activities during the night shift. This is going to require you to continue working normally while we gather evidence. Can you do that? It might take several weeks, and you'll need to act like nothing has changed. I agreed, though the thought of Dr. Mitchell continuing to exploit our residents while we built a case against him made me sick. The investigation took 3 weeks. During that time, I had to watch Dr. Mitchell continue his nighttime documentation, while hidden cameras recorded everything. It was one of the hardest things I've ever had to do, knowing that vulnerable people were being exploited while I pretended not to know what was happening. But the evidence the investigation uncovered was worse than anyone had imagined. Dr. Mitchell was part of a network that specialized in creating exploitative content featuring vulnerable adults. He had been systematically documenting elderly nursing home residents, focusing on those with dementia who couldn't report or remember his activities. The material was being sold to clients who specifically requested content featuring elderly, incapacitated individuals. The investigation revealed that Dr. Mitchell had been operating this scheme at 3 different nursing homes over the past 2 years. He would get hired as a staff physician, gain access to residents during vulnerable hours, and spend months documenting them before moving on to a new facility. His medical credentials were legitimate, which had allowed him to gain the trust of administrators and families. He had been using his position to access the most vulnerable people in our society. When police arrested Dr. Mitchell on February 28, they found thousands of images and videos on his devices, featuring elderly residents from multiple facilities. They also found detailed client lists and payment records showing that he had been making substantial money from this exploitation. The network he was part of was much larger than anyone had realized. The investigation led to arrests in 4 states and the shutdown of multiple websites that were distributing this kind of material. The impact on Sunset Manor was devastating. Families were horrified to learn that their loved ones had been exploited. Several residents had to be moved to other facilities because their families could no longer trust our institution. The nursing home faced multiple lawsuits and regulatory investigations. But what haunted me most was realizing how long this had been going on before I recognized what was happening. How many vulnerable elderly people had been victimized while staff members like me assumed that a doctor's presence meant legitimate medical care. The case changed how I approach my job. Now I question everything that seems unusual, even when it comes from medical professionals. I document any suspicious behavior, no matter how professional it might appear on the surface. Sunset Manor implemented new protocols requiring multiple staff members to be present during any after-hours patient examinations. We also installed better security systems and requires detailed documentation of all staff activities during night shifts. Dr. Mitchell was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison for exploitation of vulnerable adults and distribution of exploitative material. During his sentencing, the judge noted that his abuse of his medical position made his crimes particularly heinous. The case taught me that predators often hide behind positions of trust and authority. They count on people's assumption that medical professionals are always acting in patients' best interests. They exploit the vulnerability of people who can't protect themselves or report abuse. What scares me most is knowing that there are probably other Dr. Mitchells out there, in other nursing homes, using their positions to exploit the elderly. The investigation revealed that this network had been operating for years, moving from facility to facility, victimizing some of the most vulnerable people in our society. I still work the night shift at Sunset Manor, but now I know that sometimes the people we trust most are the ones we should watch most carefully. The elderly residents I care for depend on me to protect them, and I've learned that protection means being suspicious of everyone, even those who seem to be helping. Have you ever noticed unusual behavior from healthcare workers or other professionals around vulnerable family members? What would you do if you suspected someone was exploiting people who couldn't protect themselves? How well do you really know the people caring for your elderly relatives? I'm David Chen, and I've been installing home security systems in the Phoenix area for 8 years. What I discovered during a routine installation on Desert Vista Drive in February 2024 connected 3 separate cases of exploitation that had been happening right under everyone's noses. Sometimes the most dangerous predators are the ones who seem most helpful, and what I found in that house revealed how all these cases were linked in ways no one could have imagined. After hearing about the sleep lab conditioning, the animal control basement discovery, and the nursing home documentation scheme, I thought I understood how predators operated. But the final piece of this puzzle showed me that these weren't isolated incidents, they were all part of something much bigger and more organized than anyone realized. The call came in on February 14th from Mrs. Elizabeth Harper, a 78-year-old widow living alone in a ranch-style home on Desert Vista Drive in Scottsdale. She wanted a basic security system installed because she'd been hearing strange noises at night and felt unsafe living alone. "I know it's probably just my imagination," she told me when I arrived for the consultation. "But I keep hearing footsteps outside my bedroom window, and sometimes it sounds like someone's trying the door handles. My neighbor Mr. Thompson, well, he moved away suddenly last month after some kind of police investigation, and now I'm just nervous about living alone." The mention of Thompson made me pause. I'd been following the news about the serial killer who'd been using elderly people's basements, and I remembered that name from the reports. "Mrs. Harper, was your neighbor Robert Thompson? The one who was arrested?" "Yes, that's him. Such a shock. He seemed like such a nice young man, always offering to help with yard work and small repairs. When the police told me what he'd been doing in poor Mrs. Collins' basement," she shuddered. "Now I wonder if he was watching my house too." I assured her that a security system would give her peace of mind and began assessing her home's layout. The house was typical for the area, single-story, built in the 1980s, with large windows and sliding glass doors that offered easy access points for potential intruders. As I walked around the exterior, checking sight lines and potential camera placement, I noticed something that immediately raised concerns. There were fresh footprints in the soft dirt under her bedroom window, and the screen had small tears that looked recent. More disturbing, there were cigarette butts scattered in the bushes, and Mrs. Harper had mentioned she didn't smoke. "Mrs. Harper, have you noticed anyone spending time in your yard or around your windows?" "Well, now that you mention it, my next-door neighbor Jake Morrison has been very helpful since Mr. Thompson was arrested. He's been checking on me, making sure I feel safe. He even offered to walk around the house at night to make sure everything's secure." "Jake Morrison, is he the one who lives in the blue house next door?" "Yes, such a sweet young man. He works irregular hours, so he's often up at night anyway. He said he doesn't mind keeping an eye on things." Something about this arrangement immediately bothered me. In my experience installing security systems, the people who offer to keep an eye on things aren't always as helpful as they seem. I continued my assessment, and when I got to the back of the house, I found something that made my stomach drop. There was a small stepladder positioned under Mrs. Harper's bedroom window, and the window screen had been carefully cut and taped back together in a way that wouldn't be noticeable from inside the house. "Mrs. Harper, I need to ask you something important. Has Jake Morrison ever been inside your house?" "Oh yes, several times. He's helped me with a few small repairs, and he insisted on checking all my doors and windows to make sure they were secure. He said he wanted to make sure I was safe after what happened with Mr. Thompson." My training in security systems includes recognizing signs of unauthorized entry, and what I was seeing around Mrs. Harper's house weren't signs of random criminal activity, they were signs of systematic surveillance and access. I decided to install the security system as planned, but I also discreetly placed additional cameras that Mrs. Harper didn't know about, positioned to monitor anyone who might be watching her house from the neighboring property. "Mrs. Harper, I'm going to give you my personal cell phone number. If your system alerts for any reason, or if you feel unsafe for any reason, call me immediately. Don't hesitate, even if it seems like nothing." That night, I monitored the security feed from my home office. At 11:47 p.m., the motion sensors detected someone approaching Mrs. Harper's house from the direction of Jake Morrison's property. The figure moved confidently through Mrs. Harper's yard, clearly familiar with the layout. He went directly to the bedroom window, used the stepladder I'd found earlier, and carefully peeled back the cut screen. Then he produced what appeared to be a small camera or recording device and positioned it to have a clear view into Mrs. Harper's bedroom. The person was Jake Morrison, and he was installing surveillance equipment in an elderly woman's bedroom. I immediately called 911 and Detective Williams, whose number I'd gotten from news reports about the Thompson case. "Detective Williams, this is David Chun. I'm a security technician, and I'm watching someone install unauthorized surveillance equipment in an elderly woman's bedroom right now. I think this might be connected to your recent cases." Within 20 minutes, unmarked police cars had surrounded the area. They waited until Jake Morrison finished his work and returned to his house before moving in to arrest him. What the investigation uncovered over the next several days revealed the true scope of what had been happening in our community. Jake Morrison wasn't just a helpful neighbor. He was the coordinator of the entire exploitation network that had included Robert Thompson, Dr. Kevin Mitchell, and the sleep lab conditioning operation. Morrison had been identifying vulnerable targets, coordinating surveillance, and managing the distribution of exploitative material featuring elderly and incapacitated victims. The investigation revealed that Morrison had been operating this network for over 3 years. He would identify elderly people living alone, often by monitoring obituaries for recent widows or widowers. Then he would move into nearby rental properties and begin establishing himself as a helpful neighbor. Once he gained trust, he would systematically install hidden surveillance equipment in their homes, documenting their daily routines, sleep patterns, and most vulnerable moments. He would then recruit others like Thompson and Dr. Mitchell to access additional victims through their professional positions. The sleep lab conditioning scheme had been Morrison's idea, using Marcus Henderson's unconscious state to gather information about potential victims and their security systems. Thompson had been using that information to access properties like Mrs. Cullen's basement. Dr. Mitchell had been documenting nursing home residents according to Morrison's specifications and client requests. When police searched Morrison's house, they found a sophisticated operation. Multiple computers contained thousands of images and videos of elderly victims, organized by location and type of content. There were detailed surveillance files on over 60 elderly residents in the Phoenix area, including floor plans of their homes, daily schedules, medical information, and family contact patterns. They also found evidence that Morrison had been selling this information to criminal networks specializing in elder fraud, identity theft, and physical exploitation. Some clients paid for surveillance footage of elderly people in their homes. Others paid for detailed personal information that could be used for financial crimes. The most disturbing discovery was Morrison's client database, which showed that this network extended across multiple states and involved hundreds of victims. Morrison had been franchising his operation, teaching others how to identify and exploit elderly victims in their communities. Detective Williams explained the full scope during my interview as a witness. "David, what you uncovered was the central hub of an elder exploitation network that we've been trying to track for years. Morrison was essentially running a criminal enterprise that targeted the most vulnerable people in our society: elderly individuals living alone, people with dementia, anyone who couldn't protect themselves or report abuse." The investigation revealed that Morrison had specifically targeted the area around Mrs. Cullen's house because he knew Thompson was operating there. When Thompson was arrested, Morrison had quickly shifted to direct surveillance of other elderly residents, including Mrs. Harper. Morrison had been planning to continue Thompson's work, using Mrs. Harper's house as a base of operations. The helpful neighbor routine was his way of gaining access and trust while he systematically violated her privacy and safety. The network had been incredibly sophisticated. Morrison used encrypted communications, cryptocurrency payments, and carefully compartmentalized operations to avoid detection. Each member of the network knew only their specific role, making it difficult for law enforcement to understand the full scope of the crimes. But Morrison's arrest led to a cascade of other arrests across multiple states. The FBI took over the investigation and ultimately identified over 40 individuals involved in the network. Hundreds of elderly victims were identified, many of whom had no idea they'd been under surveillance for months or years. Mrs. Harper was devastated to learn that someone she trusted had been violating her privacy so extensively. The investigation revealed that Morrison had been entering her house regularly for over 2 months, installing cameras, documenting her routines, and even going through her personal belongings to gather information for identity theft. "I thought he was protecting me," she told me after Morrison's arrest. "He seemed so concerned about my safety, so helpful. How could I have known he was the one I needed protection from?" The case changed how I approach my security work. Now I always look for signs that someone might already be conducting unauthorized surveillance before I install legitimate security systems. I also educate my clients about the tactics predators use to gain trust and access. What haunts me most is realizing how long this had been going on before anyone recognized the pattern. Morrison had been operating for years, exploiting elderly people who trusted him completely. He had used their vulnerability and isolation against them, turning their need for security into an opportunity for exploitation. Morrison was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison for elder abuse, invasion of privacy, conspiracy, and running a criminal enterprise. During his sentencing, the judge noted that his crimes represented a systematic assault on the dignity and safety of our most vulnerable citizens. The case taught me that predators often present themselves as protectors. They identify people who need help and then exploit that need for their own purposes. Morrison had perfected the art of appearing helpful while conducting systematic abuse. Mrs. Harper eventually moved to assisted living, unable to feel safe in her home after learning the extent of Morrison's surveillance. But before she moved, she made sure I installed the most comprehensive security system possible in her house for the next owner. "I don't want anyone else to go through what I went through," she said. "No one should have to discover that the person they trusted most was the person they should have feared most." The investigation revealed that this network had been targeting elderly individuals across the country, using the same pattern of helpful neighbors, trusted professionals, and systematic exploitation. The scope was far larger than anyone had imagined, and it had been operating successfully for years because elderly victims often don't report suspicious behavior, especially when it comes from people they trust. But what we learned from breaking up Morrison's network was that these crimes are preventable. Elderly individuals need to be educated about the tactics predators use. Families need to be more involved in monitoring the people who have access to their elderly relatives. And communities need to understand that the most dangerous criminals are often the ones who seem most helpful. The 4 cases: the sleep conditioning, the basement disposal, the nursing home documentation, and Morrison's surveillance network had all been connected, all part of one criminal enterprise that targeted the most vulnerable people in our society. It took recognizing the pattern across multiple incidents to understand the full scope of what had been happening. But it also showed that when ordinary people pay attention, document suspicious behavior, and trust their instincts, even the most sophisticated criminal networks can be exposed and stopped. How well do you know the people who have access to your elderly relatives? What would you do if a neighbor seemed too helpful or interested in your daily routine? Are there signs of exploitation happening around you that you might be missing? The network Morrison was running shows us that elder abuse isn't just individual crimes, it can be organized, systematic, and much more widespread than we realize. But it also shows us that paying attention to unusual behavior and trusting our instincts can help protect the people we care about most. Thanks so much for watching. I can't express enough how much your support means. The likes, the comments, it all really helps the channel grow. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to hit that like button and share your thoughts in the comments below. I always take the time to read them. And don't forget to subscribe so you never miss out on any new videos. See you next time.